So just in the last month, in a journal called Nature Climate Change, some climate scientists did analysis of long-term climate consequences. And what they said was that human decisions made in the next decade, years to decades is what they said, will have consequences for the earth, for ecosystems, and for human beings for the next 10,000 years. So ever since I read that paper, I've just been sitting with that question. What the responsibility of being a human being alive and awake on this planet during these critical 10 years, like how best to use that time. And I think there's probably as many answers to that as there are people to answer the question, because each of us has something different to contribute or to give. For me, I think the question starts with, my profession, which is systems modeling, and my organization, Climate Interactive, is uniquely placed to be able to reflect back to the world their progress, our progress on climate change. And so one of the things that we do is we use computer simulations to take all of the pledges that different governments are making, what their promises are for climate change. And we're able to add those up and really quickly play back to the world. This is what that would mean. If you did everything you just promised, but you said this was your goal. And so right now, the countries of the world have said their goal is to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees over the next 100 years. If they did nothing, it would be about 4.5 degrees. And what they've already promised lowers that 4.5 degrees to 3.5 degrees. So we say you've made some progress and there's further to go. So clearly one job for the next 10 years is to keep doing that job of reflecting back. And I think the counterpoint to it is showing the scenarios, like that further to go, what would that look like? And so we can use our computer simulations to let people test, well, what if there was a price on carbon? What if we reforested all of the deforested areas around the equator? What if we restored soil fertility? What if we built only energy efficient buildings? So it's sort of holding that tension between there's the gap between this is what we need to do, this is what we're doing right now, and to hold that tension just as uncomfortable as it is, and to not let people have false ideas about what they've already accomplished, and not to let people give up hope, because it's not hopeless, because there's a lot that can be done. So I think one thing that can be done in the next 10 years is just continuing that process. I think the other thing is to recognize that we don't yet have the political will, the alignment of enough sectors of our societies to close that gap. And the really most promising thing I can see to do with my next 10 years is to help people understand the different things we can do, different either investments or policies that solve more problems than climate change. And so like a great example of that is if you get more cars off the road, you reduce emissions from transportation, but you also improve air quality in our urban areas. And it turns out that the savings in terms of kids with asthma and people with respiratory disease and years of life lost, the savings from that sort of thing go a really long way towards the cost of that transition to public transportation or bike paths. But so far, we really are looking at climate change in isolation, so we're like only seeing those carbon emissions and not seeing the other opportunities, each of which is a budget that could be applied to the problem, each of which is a constituency that could show up to vote or to pressure policymakers. And so that's just one example about transportation, but there's opportunities to green the cities, to build bike lanes and sidewalks, which has another public health benefit. It fights obesity and chronic disease, and again, saves all sorts of money. So there's this array of dozens of options where what's good for the long term for the climate comes together with what's good for people in the short term today. and helping people see what those opportunities are and make the connections between each other to actually do something about it. So there's sort of there's two problems. One is we don't really see those as solutions to climate change, and then we don't quite have the connections between the different sectors of businesses and governments to make the change happen. So building those connections and that sense of possibility is a big opportunity for the next 10 years. So a big part of my work is being an observer and in some ways a participant in the United Nations climate change negotiations. And we just finished a round of those December 2015, and that was called COP21. And COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and 21 means it was the 21st time that the UN has tried to come to an agreement sufficient to reduce climate change to safe levels. And they meet every year. So COP21 means for 21 years, longer than the lifetime of my teenage daughters, the world has been trying to solve this problem of climate change. Incremental progress, a lot to celebrate, but nobody would look at what just happened in Paris and say, we're done, it's solved. There's clearly a long way to go. And I think you have to ask the question then, are we framing this issue of climate change in a way where we can solve it? If it's taking us 21 years, it's the most urgent thing on the planet by many people's reckoning. Maybe we're not looking at it in a way that makes it solvable. And my friends who work in creative fields talk about the importance of the question that you start with, and they tell me, if you have 100 hours to work on a project, spend 95 on framing the question, and then the last 5 on doing the project. So it really got me thinking about how we frame this question. And there's some things that are just really never questioned in that global process. So one is that this needs to be solved by nation states. It could be framed as needing to be solved by people, or it could be framed as needing to be solved by the whole planet. It's framed as we're going to track the emissions based on where they were produced. And so if the piece of plastic stuff that I just bought from Walmart was made in China, those emissions register for China. They don't register for the United States where I live. And so in all the finger pointing about who has to do the most work to reduce emissions, that picture would look really different if we thought about it in terms of where they were produced rather than if we looked at it in terms of where they're consumed rather than where they're produced. And then touching on this idea of all the opportunities where we can reduce emissions and solve other problems at the same time. In that global process where it's focused only on the emissions of carbon, or almost only, it turns into a fight over the right to produce CO2, basically a fight over the right to pollute. Because of the advantages countries see that come out of that. And pretty much off the table are all the benefits that would come along with reducing emissions. And so you have this almost ridiculous argument about, you can't make me keep my population from dying from lung disease. You can't make me prevent poisoning my rivers and my soil with the wastes of extracting fossil fuels. And I think, 100 years from now, people are going to look back at what that fight was and really not be able to understand what we were thinking. And so in the seeds of that seems to be different ways of looking at this issue. And you see signs of it all around the world. When I was in Paris, there were all these conferences going around on the sidelines. There was like a whole day spent on climate and health, and it was basically doctors and public health officials saying addressing climate change is the biggest public health opportunity of this century. And then there was another 2-day conference on climate and development, and it was people working on poverty saying there's an opportunity in how we address climate to reduce poverty around the world. So we're not seeing it inside the process itself yet, but definitely bubbling up along the edges are people framing it in a really different way, and I think in a way that turns it from an impossible problem to one that we could really make progress on. Well, one of the themes that came up in the council this past 2 days was the importance, for our own health and our effectiveness as leaders of mindfulness and maintaining presence and really being focused on the current moment. And there seems to be a paradox in that our work is focused on the 100, 200, 500-year future, 10,000-year future. So how do you be present in the current moment and act out of responsibility to the long-term future is a question that fascinates me. I don't think I totally have an answer to it. I have a few ideas, though. One idea I think has to do with maybe learning to cultivate some kind of dual perspective. Deeply grounded and focused in the present moment, not distracted, and not focused on blame for the past, like how we got here and whose fault it is, but also with a deep awareness that these choices in the current moment are affecting the future. So it's almost like a increased need to be present and clear and mindful and deliberate in our choices. I think there's also, so maybe that's at the individual scale. I think at the more societal scale, and this is back to the question of how we frame climate change in the first place. Most climate scientists, most people focused on the transition to clean energy, really have their eye on pretty much only that long-term view. And it can come across to people who are struggling today, who need an education or whose kids are sick or are living in poverty, that we're somehow prioritizing the long-term future versus the needs of people today. And so I think that's a real dangerous trap, because then we're in this sort of ethical dilemma of the needs of people today or the needs of people in the future. And I think in the current moment, those two can collapse into the subset of things we can do that help both at the same time. There's just this universe of possibilities of things we can do that make life better in the current moment and more secure in the long term. There's a lot of things that only help in the current moment and make the long term more dangerous. And there's some things we can do that would help the long term at the expense of the short term. So there's a discernment and there's a deliberate turning away from either of those and saying we have a duty to prioritize those things that help people today and people in the long term. And I think the great news is exactly how big that sphere of possibilities is. It's really untapped.